reading the tea leaves that perhaps there's progress on trade talks. Maybe there's something in it for European markets. 6/10 plus for the CAC and DAX futures. Steve.
Brill, thanks, Karen. OK, British MPs will vote on only one part of the government's Brexit deal later today. Parliament's vote on the withdrawal agreement, which covers the transition period, the divorce bill, citizens' rights and the contentious Irish backstop. The UK government needs to secure backing of Prime Minister Theresa May's deal today in order to secure a Brexit extension to May 22nd. So, Willem, that's why technically she's doing it. Is there any rabbits out of the hat that means she'll get this through late on? I know you've got a guess with us as well, though.
Just to try and answer that question briefly, one potential reason you might try and separate the two legal documents is to encourage members of the opposition Labour Party to think about the fact that this was meant to be Brexit Day, and that those who represent constituencies in the United Kingdom who may have voted to leave the European Union might feel some sort of pressure to prove their Brexit bona fides, if that makes sense. Just to say that I'm also joined by Sir Stephen Wall. He's the former British ambassador to the European Union. You've also advised former Prime Ministers on their relationship with Europe. What would you be advising this Prime Minister right now?
Well, I think I'd be saying you can't get there from here, because it seems to me that the chances of this revised version, as it were, going through today do not look very, very high. And I think we're probably headed, therefore, either towards a forced exit door, and then there'll be some scrabbling around to try and make sure that that is less disastrous than it might otherwise be, or to a long extension, during which anything could happen, including possibly a general election, although in the present state of opinion in the parties that wouldn't solve anything, or a referendum.
You spent many years living in Brussels, and you talk about scrabbling around politically here. Do you expect there's going to be a lot of scrabbling around in Brussels trying to react to all of this uncertainty here?
I think from the point of view of our partners, their main focus now is on the European elections, and that's rather critical for them. It's critical because the main traditional parties are facing a threat from the populists, say in Italy. Monsieur Macron's his first big test, as it were, of whether his party, since the French presidential elections, can really command support. So they want a degree of stability to get on with that, and to that extent we're a distraction. I mean, my guess is that if we suddenly turn around and say, you know, actually we've decided we're going to stay, they'd probably be more pleased than not. But basically, I think now they just want to get it over and done with.
The challenge then is that if this attempt by the government to get the divorce settlement through tonight fails, we're then 13 calendar days until a new hard Brexit deadline. Parliament will once again try on Monday to find some kind of consensus around alternatives to the existing deal that's on the table. If they're not able to do that quickly enough, do you anticipate the Europeans, maybe by the 10th, 11th of April, just before that deadline, would be once again prepared to offer that extension that you're talking about?
Yeah, and I think that the thing to bear in mind is that there's no way Parliament's going to change the deal. What they can change is our idea of what we want from the European Union once we actually start the real negotiation after we've left. This withdrawal agreement is simply about leaving, and that is not open for renegotiation, I think, in any circumstances. I mean, I think our partners have reason not to want a really chaotic crash, because it affects them as well. So, I mean, there might be some extension. I mean, the crucial deadline is the 22nd of May, because that's just the eve of the European elections. So you might get a few weeks' grace, either, as I said before, to get a long extension, and I think then they would be demanding that we stay in for quite a long period, or simply trying to mitigate the worst effects of a crashing out. From that perspective, they'd be looking at it, how do we limit the damage to ourselves, rather than how do we limit the damage to the UK.
In the past, when there have been challenging moments in the European Union, there has been pretty public divisions between various countries on their positions vis-à-vis the Greek debt crisis, let's say. Over the course of the last 2 years, they have maintained quite a strong sense of unity. They have allowed the Commission often to speak on their behalf. And I wonder, when it comes to things like an extension, based on your understanding of how the institutions in Brussels work, the relationships across the European Union operate, do you think that we will suddenly start to see a bit more division between, say, France and Germany, between some of these partners inside the European Union when it comes to things like an extension length?
I think that's possible, and because I think that as you get down to the wire, people will look at their commercial interests more closely, and Germany obviously does have considerable commercial interests. I mean, the commercial tail has never wagged the political dog in Germany in that sense. I don't think you'd get a really significant sort of split on this. I mean, I think their interest in maintaining the unity of the 27 is very strong. And I mean, the biggest advantage that Brexit has had from the point of view of the rest of the European Union is that nobody now wants to leave. The Italians don't much like the situation in the euro, but they certainly don't want to leave. The Hungarians don't want to leave. The Poles don't want to leave. So in a funny kind of way, we've saved Europe by our example, bad example though it is.
One final question then for businesses, investors watching the situation here in Westminster and in Brussels over the next 4 or 5 days. What should they really focus on in terms of developments in your view?
Well, the crucial development is whether what happens, well, obviously what happens today is critical, but assuming that Theresa May doesn't get her vote, then to see whether that does focus minds in Parliament so that there is a clearer picture in Parliament of the kind of future relationship that Britain wants. If, for example, the Ken Clarke amendment calling for a customs union, in other words, a very close relationship economically, were to prevail, then certainly in terms of Britain's long-term future and economic certainty, that's a much better prospect than spending the next 18 months or possibly much longer simply flailing around trying to find some kind of deal in terms of our long-term relationship that works.
I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. That was Sir Stephen Wall, former British ambassador to the EU, suggesting that he is one of many pessimists about the chances for Theresa May's government to pass tonight's effort, and also reiterating that people should be focusing on Monday when, of course, Parliament will come back and try and find its own alternative solution to this deadlock, guys.
Willem, thank you very much indeed for that. Let me just bring something to your attention, which the markets will probably already be starting to react to. Via Twitter, the US Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, has said he and Lighthizer, the trade negotiator for the United States, have concluded constructive trade talks in Beijing. This is a tweet that's crossing right now. It goes on to say, we look forward to welcoming the Chinese Vice Premier to continue important discussions in Washington next week. Now, the markets will have to draw their own conclusion on exactly how positive that really is in terms of laying out a program or a pathway to a successfully concluded agreement. But, I mean, this has been the not too hot, not too cold approach that we've had on the trade talks all the way along here, and the markets have reacted every time. Patrick, I mean, look at that dollar chart. You could probably time those moves by the comments that we've had from US politicians and government officials. What do you make of these remarks, and how would you go about making money from them?
Well, I think that's probably as emphatic as he can get, because if they are making very good progress, he's not going to want to steal Trump's thunder. So that's something he's going to defer to Trump, and it sounds like there may even be a further meeting in April. People are talking about between Xi and Trump themselves to announce a deal. We're going to get a deal. I don't think it's going to be all-encompassing. There's going to be movements from China where they import more soybeans and U.S. goods, and they'll have deals on intellectual property, forced transfer of things, and then China will end up cheating on them, but that's still a very market-friendly deal. So I don't think you get a real resolution to the issues that can't be resolved, but you get a truce, no escalation in tariffs, and maybe a slow de-escalation and removal of tariffs in the coming months.
Do you sell into any spike in risk assets on this?
Haven't yet.
Or do you accumulate and buy on those?
So we've been buying the dips on emerging markets and on China. When we started buying emerging markets in China in December, it felt very contrarian. We're at the point now where it's a very consensual view, so that's the risk. I think it's gone from being a contrarian bet, betting against the end of the world and trade wars really escalating, is how it felt in December. I think I'm in a crowded trade right now, being long emerging markets, but the valuations keep me in them. So 12 times earnings on emerging markets as a whole is relatively cheap. 2.8% dividend yield on emerging markets that are obviously going to grow faster than the developed world in the coming decade. Yeah. Those are things that don't look like I'm in a very crowded trade on valuations, despite the feeling that I think I'm in a crowded trade just from what people are saying right now.
Let's read this next read, and just in passing, let's mention that H&M shares seen rising as much as 8 to 10% after the Q1 earnings. We brought you those numbers. Oh, sorry, Karen, this was...
I was just going to jump in also and say that it was, I think, about this deal that H&M product will be sold on the Indian e-commerce platforms, Myntra and Jabong. I think that might be part of it, along with the earnings, because obviously big scale to a huge population. It's quite key.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has accused foreign powers of launching a speculative attack against his country after the Turkish lira saw a day of high volatility. Speaking to supporters at a campaign rally, he said the West is trying to put pressure on Turkey. The drop in the lira came as Turkish net foreign reserves dropped by $10 billion in March. The country will hold local elections this weekend. Patrick, this is what I wanted to come back to you on, because as you point out, everybody is moving into this emerging trade, both equity and bond. But the last 24 hours have been tumultuous in terms of little probing attacks on emerging currencies. And it's not just been the Turkish lira that's been under pressure. We've seen the Hong Kong Monetary Authority back in the market, defending the Hong Kong dollar. Where there are perceived to be vulnerabilities, there is some probing going on at the moment with fast money.
Yeah, and while the emerging markets are the biggest beneficiary of the dovish turn from the Fed, I think. And I think that still is overwhelming everything else. So you've got a lot of issues still in emerging markets, a lot of imbalances that the market's going to probe, as you characterize it. I think while free money is available, that's a tailwind for emerging markets, and the carry you're getting on the emerging market currencies, the dividend yield on the stocks, and the relatively cheap valuations, that's enough to overcome the other imbalances that are still there, and we're not going to get rid of.
I think you make an interesting comment, but I might diverge from you slightly. You said it's fast money. Now, I've always historically thought it's fast money, but it's the Turks themselves. Now, they may be quite fast money, but they do not represent the international speculator. They represent Turks who are worried, you know, very wealthy Turks out there who are very worried, so then they're holding more dollars, and they're continuing to put that trade on. And again, I'll just say that figure I read on Reuters yesterday, $106 billion worth of Forex deposits and funds, including precious metals, incidentally, which is another issue, from Turkish local individuals. That's the record level they've ever held. So Mr. Erdogan has got many battles to fight, and goodness knows he goes on the front foot on all of his battles, but it's not just the international speculators, it's his own people he's got to fight on this one.
Yeah, you can see the attraction to owning foreign assets and currencies if you do have a big chunk of your wealth in Turkish lira, that's for sure.
But when you run into a foreign currency issue or balance of payments issue, you very often turn to the IMF. And funnily enough, I'm just doing some work on the IMF in Ukraine ahead of our coverage next week as well. But you need friends within the Washington consensus, potentially. And again, this question was raised yesterday. Does Turkey have friends within the Washington institutions? World Bank, IMF, etc., etc. And the answer is, and other central banks as well, let's chuck that in there as well. The answer is, it's questionable.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and yeah, I'm not sure of the answer.
The point you make, though, about the crowded trade, and you think there's enough in it at the moment to justify you being there, yeah. Do you see a point during the course of this year where you will say, that's it, fine, I've had my money, I'm going to walk away from this? Because the shifts that we've seen in various asset classes over the last week, like the drop in gold from above 1,300, the strength we've had in oil, perhaps the weakness we've seen in palladium, there is a shift going on, it seems to me, in the way the market is thinking about different asset classes, and a lot of it is implying that we're entering a more deflationary phase rather than inflationary. Yeah. Which raises a lot of issues about how emerging markets then, which are ultimately a cyclical play on growth, will respond.
Yeah, or it's a disinflation maybe more than deflation is still how I'd characterize it. And I think the disinflation means easy monetary policy, which is the tailwind for emerging markets. A lot of concerns about the inversion on the yield curve. That's the precursor to a recession. Our view is the U.S. isn't moving into recession in the near term, but recession is obviously terrible for emerging markets. If we don't get the trade deal, it's probably a consensus view now too, that could be terrible for emerging markets. So there's definitely risk there. Emerging markets are up 15–20% this year on the equities. But that's not really outperformed the developed world. So on a relative basis, we started buying emerging markets because they were cheap versus the rest of the world. They're 15% more expensive now, but all the other alternatives are basically similar situation as well.
Speaking of developed world, we've got some numbers crossing from France today, and this seems to be an underwhelming set of numbers. The inflation rate crossing the EU harmonised CPI rate 1.3% year on year, below forecast that was expected 1.4%, and also below the February level, quite a significant unwind from 1.6% posted in that month. So that's weaker than expected, and the consumer spending numbers too have also come through weaker than anticipated at -0.4% on month, -1.8% on year. Yellow vest movement having an impact here, and when it comes to the French budget balance, that's also worse than anticipated, -36.9 billion euros at the end of February versus -28.48 billion a year earlier, so going in the wrong direction. Coming up on the show, we'll unveil one of the winners from this year's Allocator.com Investors' Choice Awards. That's coming up after the break.
Traversing new grounds demands clarity of direction. Nomura keeps you fiercely focused on your goals. With our unique research capabilities and insights into Asia, we provide the solutions of tomorrow today. Nomura, connecting markets east and west.
Channel Japan. Get the latest stories from Japan as they happen on the ground. Japanese car navigation system makers fight for survival. Concierges appear in the world of business. And a dish made with fresh local ingredients draws long lines. Every week, direct from Tokyo, Channel Japan.
I'd like to donate these books.
Thank you very much.
Where do you get that book?
A man donated it.
Yes? I'm sorry, but I need to retrieve... I don't leave you looking for this. No. Thank you so much. Return the book.